Asking for It, a Novel Approach, Episode 4. Chapter 10. In his fantasy, Lance would wrap her in a mink-cowled boxer's warm-up robe, Michaela the Knife, in gold silk embroidery across the back. Of course, he'd really rather she stays far away from the real fight game. There's always someone tougher than you. That's the simple truth of it. It could only be a matter of time before the fantasy of Michaela the Knife suffered a wholly inappropriate real-life beatdown. Since discovering her, Lance has done some research, watching bouts of women's MMA. He never wants to see Michaela overmatched, arm-barred and broken. He's seen that torment. He's flinched with visceral revulsion at what they call the ground and pound. Fists would rain down where she's pinned to the canvas. He's seen the blood, imagining his diva on the receiving end. Heresy. Putting a riding crop in her hand might be the answer. Sublimate the violence. Make it all a well-defined game. Eliminate the very existence of true opponents. Good then, but the cliched world of whips and masks sadomasochism does not represent the groundbreaking opportunity Lance is looking for. You see more and more of it in the mainstream, but the optics would be all wrong for Michaela. Optics. He pictures a gangster's bulletproof Bentley, Michaela stepping out of it onto the red carpet. He knows he needs to get behind the images, dig beneath the surface if he's going to come up with anything substantial. In school, they looked at the classical underpinnings to everything contemporary in art. Maybe he can make the myths serve now. He fixes quickly upon the myth of Pygmalion, the sculptor who beds his own creation. The irony of looking to this particular myth is not lost on him. He remembers thinking, the guy's like an idiot little brother to Prometheus. He somehow manages to stumble through. I mean, the gods wouldn't give Prometheus a light in the driving rain, and they had eagles tear his guts out when he helped himself. Pygmalion is asking literally to play God, and no one says boo. In Shaw's version, Victorian England takes the barbs his nasty hero is spared. But the arrogant linguist, who remakes the impoverished Eliza Doolittle, pays precious little for his godly pretensions. Try as he may, Lance cannot recall any moral to the Roman myth. A guy falls in love with his own creation. Some god does him the service of animating his sculpture, with whom he then lives happily ever after. Surely, in transcribing the tale, someone down the years forgot the part where he suffers some tragic indignity for the overreaching ambition of his desire. Even the great George Bernard Shaw seems untroubled by this hubris. Why is he struck upon Pygmalion? There is not much of the alabaster statue in the pugnacious Michaela Mendoza. There is, however, something universal at work here. Every man's love interest, in its germinal phase, involves a degree of the Pygmalion. Before even speaking to the attractive woman, men begin shaping in her an ideal refined continuously from boyhood on. The lengths they go to vary, but most men, some inadvertently, some not, will attempt to shape the woman after the ideal. Lance is not about to write the next great classics-inspired art film. He is veering near the margins of his theme, well out of his psychological depth. Still, he continues dogged, racking his brain for a simple yet compelling Michaela story. A good narrative is what they are missing to set her out ahead of the competition. Mythology isn't getting him far. How then are narratives come by? His subject is right before him. This will be a work of authenticity, even if it comes from a less than writerly mind. Maybe it'll open on to something more, something real, for Michaela, before her real-life story takes a bad turn. Instinct and passion will help him render a story worthy of her. He examines his feelings and concedes that the cards are all in Michaela's hand. He can boast success and expertise in his field, but somehow these weigh inconsequentially the moment he meets Michaela's irreverent gaze. Life's ugly exigencies haven't occurred to her yet. She seems almost to be smiling, if not outright laughing, in life's face. He has to attribute a good part of his infatuation to Michaela's youth. Like the Edge, Lance has the 40-year-old's preoccupations with youth. Unlike the Edge, though, Lance is now 50. A trim and well-preserved 50, perhaps. No lines to speak of, only the tiniest bit of gray if he lets his sideburns grow in. But 50 nonetheless. Both men look at Michaela, lust after her, the way only the tyrannized can. No cozy love interest here. It is more Stockholm Syndrome. The attraction each feels is intensified 1,000-fold by the sense of Michaela's youth representing life itself. They are imprisoned, of course, by their own inclination. This melancholy realization does nothing to dampen Lance's desire. In psychological terms, he should do them both a favor and leave her well alone. But Lance Abierti, successful entertainment professional, feels helpless in his need for this scrappy young upstart. Lance ruminates on the recipe of his distraction: 50% youth and 50 beauty. The lethal combination seems prosaic at a glance, but otherwise mature men, and a certain number of women as well, he imagines, routinely fall prey to youthful good looks. Empires fall to them. Careers crumble. The very foundations of self-respect dissolve in their perilous element. For the most, the hopelessly worshipful, the formula of their downfall is even more exacting. 50% youth, 50 beauty, and 0 vulnerability. Though perceived vulnerability informs the feminine mystique, for certain men the genuine article is more anathema than attractive. Faced with reality, these men love to fantasize. Faced with real women, they covertly idealize. Humans are mutually affective, but the fantasy, the uber-woman, is someone virtually above emotion. She can transcend time itself, for that matter. The aesthetic perfection of youth lasts well into her maturity. The persuasion of her feminine wiles is eternal. She morphs, age lines somehow diminished by sheer force of character. Her self-possession promotes the willing victim's slavish suspension of disbelief. This impregnable woman demands all and nothing at once. Her worshipper is tasked with providing her every whim, short of mating and siring her young. Says who, though? Times are changing. Lance can easily imagine the supreme female's retinue including a man to rear her offspring, the way others might drive her car or varnish her nails. Oh, he is erring far and wide today. He remembers the confused labyrinth effect well from his school days' efforts at writing. Chapter 11. She thinks it's funny. He thinks it into a perversion. Things go over the top. It was a bit of a problem. When he was a 12-year-old in middle school, the Edge got really turned on by the tomboys. They were the only girls he could relate to. He kind of liked the girly girls too, but they spoke an entirely different language. They liked it when guys flounced around, flexing and talking a lot of really loud, really predictable bullshit. By the time he'd made it through his awkward teen years, the Edge was only really turned on by women who liked women. The butcher, the better. Short of the overweight, undergroomed truck driver types, maybe. Before he'd even heard of misogyny, The edge was well into androgyny. The man-haters who made it seem so sexy were just his cup of tea. He wasn't sure they really existed. They were like, what, dinosaurs with tits or something. But his mother's overheated slamming of men formed a background soundtrack to his teens. His room was next to the kitchen in the little bungalow his mother rented. Her strenuous dirt dishing over the phone mixed with the hum and rattle of their ancient refrigerator. This disgruntled girl talk was the last thing he heard drifting off to sleep every night, and it often resumed directly upon his waking. His mother's caffeine-fueled morning rants accompanied his reflections upon his night's dreaming, the awesome, if awkward, desires he felt defining him. So from pre-adolescence to the present, the edge prized a woman's sneer and her acid tongue above even her loveliest and lovingest attributes. His entire sexual life long, he'd craved abuse at their hands. So, yeah, bit of a problem. Michaela's immigrant parents assimilated so thoroughly, not teaching their daughter Spanish was just the beginning. Big Catholic family values were nowhere in evidence as the little-seen father was resolutely abandoned by Michaela's extravagantly beautiful mother. Mother and daughter's roots went quick and deep into the American experience. The rejected birth father was replaced with a gringo, oil patch roustabout, and his 3 feral sons. In the new man's routine absences, but with the benefit of his regular income, Michaela's mother made young men of the man-cubs, and her daughter grew up an accidental American. Godless, descended from the God-fearing, Michaela had to simply shrug when she considered the tiny cameo and crucifix, her only bequests of a grandmother lost to time and a rural village obliterated by earthquake somewhere in southwestern Nicaragua. They are having the talk. Lovers and their beloveds the world over and down through the ages have had it. Discomfort with the lover's growing infatuation moves the beloved to reject it, or desperation at felt invisibility compels the lover to declare. It can take many forms, though usually the talk is of constraints on freedom, of passions insurmountable. Often it resolves tensions. Just as often it exacerbates them. Usually, if both parties have paid attention, in future it will be a little clearer what can be expected, each from the other. So when I hit you, you go down, and you don't get up until I tell you. Right. And if you try to get up, I kick you hard in the back of the head before you get past your knees. Right. And so ends Chapter 11 and Part 2 of Asking for It, a Novel Approach. Part 3, Woman Forward. Chapter 12. Lance is flying home from an exciting meeting with his old friend Jim's Streetheart in Toronto. Jim's loves Michaela, and he will help. Traveling for business several years ago, Lance made a similar trip back to the city of his birth. He'd met Streetheart on that occasion, and before his return flight to Miami, his business had been all but forgotten. Lance Abierti was just starting out in the talent representation game then, and he'd flown up to Toronto on a hunch. The International Film Festival, TIFF for short, had just begun to boom. The competition for FaceTime was not the grind that it was in LA. Yet there was opportunity and profile aplenty. It was strange at first. He'd been away long enough that, revisiting Canada, he experienced a sense of throwback. The anachronism of British law and governance transplanted in the New World. The feeling was typical for Americans, he knew that. On the surface, it was plain the place resembled a large U.S. center more than any image he had of Old England. On this occasion, Beyond a feeling of transculturation, the British sensibilities steepened and found embodiment in the aristocratic person of Jim's Streetheart. There was a mixer they'd both attended, an event on the margins of the tiff. The dapper and diminutive Jim's Streetheart introduced himself at a bar staffed by a pair of near-identical beauties clad in something like French maids' outfits. The Englishman declared how very inappropriate this was. Lance, only half listening, his gaze combing the crowd for semi-celebrities, was none the less struck by the remark. He turned a charming American smile to this multiple Jim and asked him for clarification. Women displayed as subservient, degraded by stereotypes, it's all too insulting. One of the girls did a little shimmy in response to something her colleague had to say, and they laughed, then high-fived each other. I don't know, they seem to be having a pretty good time. Don't get me wrong, I agree, You just? Play along? I suppose I must say the same, to my infinite shame. A brief silence fell between them before Lance found the right words. Well, to our shame, then. Long may we live it down. The little Englishman considered the proposition with a wry expression. He pushed his glasses up atop his head. His eyes shut, and he squeezed the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger. After a beat, he replaced his glasses and tilted his scotch minutely toward Lance with what seemed a grudging smile. They clinked drinks, and each looked away over the boisterous crowd once more. During the next half hour, and again for much longer the following day, Lance listened raptly to Streethart's story. His mother, a devout Latter-day Bluestocking, managed the young Jims's upbringing, ran their considerable household in Oxfordshire, and hosted a spirited weekly salon for women's affairs, all while keeping his drunk and dissolute father from ruining her family's fortunes. A seemingly endless caravan, twisting and turning through Crusade years and beyond, from its earliest recorded origins on the island of Malta in the 1100s, her family, whose name Jims's mother meant to relegate to oblivion, carried its riches to the present day. On more than one occasion, young Jims, concealed behind the salon's lustrous draperies, simmering beside one of the ancient home's newly installed cast-iron radiators, peeped out upon mysteries of a womanly world, filled with elegance and enduringly fascinating. A fantastically wealthy Persian princess, her retinue parked in another room for her visit, would unveil herself to relax among the Englishwomen, dames and otherwise. A towering academic would regale them with bawdy tales of riding parties turned raunchy, then with pithy appreciations of Sappho. They discussed the likes of Camille Claudel and Colette, the works, lives, and loves of these contemporary creative spirits. Another salonist spoke of friendship with the great Latvian poet and playwright Aspasia. That fascinating woman's ancient Greek namesake, Aspasia, well ahead of her time, by all accounts unwed, had none the less birthed a son to Pericles. Plutarch relates her establishing a salon of intellectual life that attracted the cream of Athenian intellectual society. Socrates was among the good company there. Jims grew up with progressive notions vis-à-vis the sanctuaries of woman love and the matrimonial evils men do. The women of the Streetheart salon may have shared sexual mores with their Belle Epoque cousins across the Channel in France, but it was English politics of the day that provoked them. They carved away at every notable buttress of peerage. They made good English mincemeat of the nation's lords, its industrialists and parliamentarians. Men in general did not fare well in their tirades. The effects would intoxicate young Jims for life. On his flight back from the tiff, Lance was impatient with flight attendants and his fellow passengers alike. He felt vaguely derelict, behind schedule, under suspicion. The list of anxieties that cropped up in his mind amazed and oppressed him. He snoozed uneasily just before arrival in Miami and woke convinced he had left something unsaid during his encounter with Jim's streetheart. He'd enjoyed the man's company immensely. His anecdotes and fervently held opinions. He'd been very impressed with the Streetheart Manor home, a place where old England genuinely had found roots in the New World. And he genuinely admired the man's character. What rankled were the refrains to women's woeful social misplacement beneath men. Even an equal footing with men did them a disservice. At times, what he'd taken for comic hyperbole ended by hitting very close to home. Years later now, Lance is flying business class, but feeling the same misgivings. Countless times since their first encounter, he's considered his female clients in Streetheart's terms. And countless times he's looked to his childhood for answers. Unlike with Streetheart, though, a notion of females' mystical eminence had only taken root in his childhood mind obscurely. It had no clear origin. Girls were simply other. Wives and mothers, sisters and daughters, all unknowable. Unknowable, they were irreproachable. From the merest slight to the most cutting taunt, they escaped the moral code that bound young Lance so firmly. Even more baffling, they seemed largely unfazed by what his generation already knew to be patently chauvinist male behaviors. Lance had never gotten beyond generalizations where it came to extrasexual relations. Extrasexual was a term he relished for its comic strip appeal. Long after he'd relegated the last of his own comics to the dusty cardboard box archives in his parents' suburban basement, Lance sustained the adolescent male's animated perspective on life. Alas, what preoccupied him on and off, well beyond adolescence, was extrasexual in the sense of outside the sexual, as opposed to any surfeit thereof. Not that he'd done badly in that department. He spent his youth involved in the boozy, dopey courtship rituals typical of North America in the 70s. But exiting that decade, he felt a keen contradiction. He felt stigmatized. At university, the feminism of the day convinced him of belonging to a men's club of privilege. Privately perplexed, he cherished a few well-worn Wonder Woman fantasies over the years, but made no sophisticated effort to understand the titillation there. Much later, he tried some talk therapy, when that trend gained currency and his income climbed into the comfort zones. Aside from sustaining a subdued sexual undercurrent, the well-groomed woman therapist's weekly sessions failed to unearth much of interest. Notwithstanding his nagging failure to understand women in general, Lance decided his psychic reality was probably no more or less unusual than the average. Not crazy, then. And yet, reclining in his plush business-class seat, Lance is ambushed by a familiar shame. On that earlier return flight, he'd cursed his flippant toast the night he met Jim's streetheart. Living down this shame could be a life's work. He hadn't thought of that possibility, unwittingly raising his glass against himself. What unsettles him now? Heading home more successful, more comfortable than ever. What is it? Is he in trouble with Michaela? To this point, he's rationalized his enthusiasm by focusing on the professional potential she represents. Now he can hardly see beyond her, the mighty attraction she exerts upon him. He no longer imagines the tangible benefits to himself. much less any emotional perks. She is simply and majestically there, in the center of his world, exerting a preternatural compulsion. Lance closes his eyes. His cheek against the ultra-suede upholstery, he surrenders all over again to this force, Michaela Mendoza, fighter, funny girl, cipher.